Oof, it's been a while. It is hard to critique a great game. It's even harder to figure out how you would actually improve it. This is the case for Slay the Spire, the first roguelite that's actually gotten me back into the whole genre. With games like Dead Cells or even Crypt of the Necrodancer, I enjoy those games, but they're not really for me. I didn't feel myself coming back to them after a while. Compare this to Isaac, where I'm up in the upper 100s, and Slay the Spire is the only one that's come close to that. I think I'm at about 90 hours logged in the game so far, and so I've been pretty impressed. However, as I've been playing, it's always felt like there's been something missing. And so, it's on the skewer tonight for my series, I Could Do It Better. For those of you who haven't watched my prior videos, I Can Do It Better is all about how I would make the game much better if I had the programming expertise, the intelligence, and the gobs of time to do something to it. I don't have any of those, but I like to pretend I do. So, what I bring up are not supposed to be critiques like I would put in a review. Instead, I have to use my imagination to create something that is entirely different. In the case of Slay the Spire, it's not going to be as different as maybe I have said in my other videos, and many of you may disagree with what I may have, but you know what? That's what comments are for, and that's what also ignoring is for, so you can quit out whenever you want to, you slime bucket. Let's get to it. As in the other videos, we will go over critiques just so we get that out of the way and done. The biggest thing that Slay the Spire needs is more. We need more relics, we need more enemies, we need more content. It already has quite a bit. Again, I've played the game for 90 hours already. But compared to some other roguelites, I feel like I've seen everything by about the 20-hour mark. The other 70 hours was just my own neurotic playing. And so if you add those concepts, that'd be great. And the graphics and sound aren't anything to write home about, so those could probably be improved. How? I don't know. So that's why I leave that much to the side. One thing I will say is it doesn't need more cards. I do believe the developers did an amazing job at balancing the game mechanics in that way. I feel like there's a nice arrangement of cards, and no one card seems super crappy except for maybe one or two per character. Another critique I have of the game is I wish there was one more character. Each of the characters so far, the Ironclad, the Silent, and the Defect, all have their specific focus. With Ironclad, you have attacks. With the Silent, you have skills. And with the Defect, you have powers. I still wish there was some other character that would allow us a new type of playstyle. Compared to other games, Slay the Spire doesn't have that much variety in terms of who you pick to play. As for the actual changes, the new revisions I would make to the game, I have 3 in mind. The first change I would suggest is something that I have seen the player community also ask for, and that is more story. Currently the story is basically the Spire, like a bad case of diarrhea, came out of nowhere and is all consuming. And the 3 characters that we can play all find their way to the Spire through one way or another. Once they're in the Spire, they must fight through a series of enemies of various kinds. Some are devoted to some god, another one just seems like demons, what have you. And at the bottom of this tower is the goddess Niao. I at least think that's how you pronounce it. It's supposed to be an onomatopoeia of what whales sound like, so maybe a Niao something. This goddess has a vendetta against the Spire, and once your character's in, she continually revives you, resurrects you so that you can fight for her again and ultimately slay the heart and the Spire altogether. That's the story. You get all these details and like the character slides and a few of the events, and when you finally do beat the heart with a character, you're treated to one cutscene, which basically shows your characters escape from the tower. Additionally, you see the whale say to herself, "I can finally slumber," or something to that effect. It's a pretty anemic story, even as far as roguelites go. You have something like Enter the Gungeon, where the lore is spread out entirely through the game, especially in the descriptions of the items. And Binding of Isaac has a whole community that was devoted to trying to figure out what the hidden meaning was. Slay the Spire doesn't have that. In terms of how we can make that change happen with this game, is I think you have to look more at the characters. For instance, I'm going to take the Ironclad. The Ironclad was brought to the tower because he was seeking to be the best of the Ironclads in his little posse, clique, whatever. He made a deal with the devil and became super powerful, but at the same time he killed everybody in his village. You know, that's the typical response you get when you make a deal with the devil. I'm surprised that this trope is still used, unless he's never read comics in his life. Anyway, he comes to the tower, and at that point we lose all character from him. My suggestion would be is that we find a way to learn more about him as he progresses through the tower. Like, for instance, let's say he's still pursuing that power. There's cards that give you interactions with the devil, and so maybe as he progresses through the story, he becomes more and more unhinged, more demonic. You don't necessarily need to see characteristics of him change to fit that demon aspect. But what we could do is maybe have a little more story, maybe caught through the events or in the cutscenes when you finish a round, that show that he's becoming more and more inhuman. Maybe his deck changes in some aspect, and you learn more about his motives or something along those lines. Again, how do we do that? That'll be the point I get to next. But regardless, with these characters, I want to see momentum. It doesn't have to be this overarching narrative that connects all three together, but I want to see some sort of flow with the story where I'm like, yeah, that's a thing, rather than, I better go to Reddit and ask people, what do we know of the game? The next component I will talk about is probably the one that will get me in trouble from fans, and that is the difficulty system. Currently, Slay the Spire is built on ascensions when you get better. Every time you beat the third boss, you upgrade it at ascension level, and each of these levels carries with it a new handicap. It starts off with bosses are harder, or you get more elite enemies, and it can extend to taking more damage from enemies, taking damage at the beginning, not healing as much between rounds, starting with a curse, a lot of bad things. It all stacks up to the point where you get to Ascension 20 when you're so bogged down by handicaps where you either have to be the most skilled player in the world to win or extremely lucky. It follows the same system that Dead Cells does, where you beat the boss and the game gets harder. I can appreciate that because that creates longevity for certain players who are extremely dedicated to the system. For me, I don't quite appreciate it because it seems like a cheap way to upgrade the difficulty. Of course, if I have more things going against me, I'm going to lose. But in terms of skill, this is not a component that is in Slay the Spire. Deck building is important, as is piloting your deck, but there are certain things that you just can't control. If you're given a crappy hand and that all the upgrades are bad as you move forward, you're going to lose that round. It doesn't matter how well you play. Even with a game like Binding of Isaac, if you don't get good upgrades, you could still feasibly win. And maybe this is just me and my idiocy saying, but I do not think you can win every round of Slay the Spire, because inevitably, RNGs is going to screw you over. So how do we change that? We can look at other roguelites to see how they've done it. Bringing up Crypt of the Necrodancer again, that game creates different difficulties by giving you different characters. Binding of Isaac has 2 difficulties to choose from, and the hard difficulty gives you fewer hearts and harder enemies. And a game like Neurovoider just makes it extremely harder to kill enemies, and they do more damage. For Slay the Spire, I do think it needs to stick to 3 difficulty modes, and this is where the story comes in. I say that the first run is very much like how it is now. You learn the basics of the game, you get your character to the 3rd boss. There's no extra doohickeys or anything like that. However, with the 2nd and 3rd difficulties, which are unlocked once you beat the game, I suggest their difficulty is changed based on story-driven content. Let's go back to the Ironclad. Let's say every run he finishes, he is more overcome by his demon self. And when he's more in his demon self, he's not thinking. He screws up more, and he becomes more just full of rage. So let's say in your 2nd run, the cards you are dealt at the beginning aren't just common strikes where you deal 6 damage. Instead, let's say you start off with 2 extra power, but each of your strikes deal damage to you in some way. Kind of like, I hurt more, but I hurt more to others and inside. It's like mental health or something. but it changed the deck building, so you have to be a little more careful. You have to see how much damage output you can create without killing yourself. And then let's say for the third run, you still have that set deck building. But as you incorporate more attacks into your deck, as you're more likely to do with the Ironclad, your ability to path or choose which path you take when you're selecting the next level is limited. We can say maybe the third stage you get to, where you have to find the final boss, you just have one path to follow. It doesn't branch out. You're stuck with just one lane. Some may say that makes the game less fun. I think it's a nice variation just to force you to get rid of that strategic element and prepare yourself to just face anything essentially. If we take another character, let's say the Defect. The Defect starts off as this robot that was once part of the Spire but gained sentience and decided to fight against it and go with Meow. What I would be interested in is the longer the Defect sticks around the Spire, the more it becomes corrupted and wishing to return to that kind of be one of the enemies once more. And so maybe what you see across the game is that you pick up viruses, similar to the curses that are in the game, but the viruses augment your abilities to cast orbs or how much damage they do. Maybe it glitches out that you're on one pathway and then all of a sudden you're on another pathway entirely. That as you continue through the difficulties, your character does less and less of what you want. This adds a whole nother layer of randomness, which is something that I wanted to avoid. And so the Defect would be something that we'd have to think more and brainstorm about. But you get what I'm trying to get to, which is I want the difficulty to be based individually on the character. Maybe even the heart, which you fight on, maybe the final round, is more tied specifically to the character. It has different attacks, different attributes, and it's this one great final battle. Of course, I'd love more cutscenes or content after you beat that heart, but I don't really know what to put, so I can't really criticize the game for it. Again, people like their Ascension system because they like the fact that the difficulty keeps ramping up. And so maybe you keep the Ascension system and add this story-driven content. Who knows? I just have been unsatisfied with this difficulty level, and I'll admit that currently I'm on Ascension 8 with the Ironclad, I think 6 for the Silent and 6 for the Defect. So take from it what you will. The final component, I think, is something that would be welcome to everybody, and that is the introduction of a challenge system. I am dissecting this and pulling it directly from the Binding of Isaac, which has its own menu of challenges where there's a set number of restrictions or buffs that lead to a whole new type of game. We already see this in the daily system of Slay the Spire. Each daily has 3 augmentations that change the run. Maybe you start with items, maybe you're more likely to get curses, but you have certain relics that help you accommodate curses. Some make you lose max HP as you go on, and others allow you to take different colored cards from other character types. Even if you may be Ironclad, you can get green or blue cards. I really enjoy this concept, and I'd like to see a challenge mode where it is more tailored with those buffs and handicaps. So for one of the challenges that I have in my mind, it'd be something like with the Ironclad. The Ironclad has a set of cards that go more towards a defensive build, and I really think they're awesome. Like Juggernaut. Every time you gain defense, you deal 5 damage to the enemies. I have been able to do it once, but it's not very common for me just because it's so dependent on other cards, and ultimately, the Ironclad is an offensive build. So for this challenge, it would promote you taking more defensive cards. It would give you the Juggernaut and give you like metallics to begin with, and it'd say that your max HP goes down every floor. So it really prioritizes keeping yourself safe, and it gives a new experience. These challenges would offer another opportunity to unlock relics and maybe cards. And so I'd really appreciate that aspect of the game, because one criticism I have against it is that after you level up your characters the most, and this is what gets you new relics and cards, there's nothing else to unlock. I can appreciate it because new content isn't locked behind extremely difficult restrictions, at the same time, I want something to give it a little more longevity. And I do say that having played 90 hours of it already. So those are the changes I would suggest for Slay the Spire. Again, it's a fantastic game. I really enjoy it. It just feels like it deserves a sequel at this point. Whereas a game like Binding of Isaac, where I can't really fathom what that sequel would be, for Slay the Spire, I do think there could be a much improved second game. And I just wish it was in this first game. Again, the developers were awesome in how they did it. I just want more. So, do you agree with me? Do you not? I don't care! But you can voice your comments wherever you want. Until then, well, bye.